Okay, let's dive in. We're going to talk about activating your donor advised fund donor base with special guest Lisa Barr of NPT. Lisa is one of the top two or three or four people in the country in terms of expertise on donor advised funds. We love having her. This is our second time having her on a webinar. She and I also gave a talk in person last year at Charitable Gift Planners. Lisa is an absolute all-star. So we're so glad to have her. So at some point, we will welcome her. And NPT is also one of the top donor advised funds in the country. They do incredible work. So shout out to them as well. A couple housekeeping notes. As you might have guessed, this is approved for 1.0 CFRE credits. Thank you, everybody. We will send the recording and the slides around later today. Someone's still going to ask. You can help me out in the chat by telling them. And we will answer as many questions as we can. You can also throw some questions in Q&A. So please feel free to do that. Here's the agenda for today. Intros. Why donor advised funds are so important. Then we'll turn it over to Lisa, and then we'll answer questions and talk about some next steps. So you all have the slide deck later. Intros. My name is Patrick. This is what I look like with a giant beard. This is my wonderful co-founder, Jenny. I am in Brooklyn, New York. Jenny is in the great city of Seattle, Washington. We together are the co-CEOs and co-founders of FreeWill, which, some of you might know this, is the biggest planned giving solution in the United States, trusted by 2,300 leading nonprofits. We also do a lot of work supporting stocks, qualified charitable distributions, donor advised funds, AI, and grant writing. So feel free to ask about any of that. Trusted by all sorts of wonderful organizations that you love and featured in all sorts of periodicals. We have raised more than 3 billion, excuse me, three, that's not true anymore. Well, it is true, but we have also raised more than $13 billion for nonprofits to date, which we're very excited about. And we have a lot of experience. Okay, here's a gift. This book just came out. Some of you have read The Daily Stoic. Some of you have been given The Daily Stoic by your friends at FreeWill. There is a new book by Ryan Holiday called Wisdom Takes Work. I have not read it. I have ordered it. I have not read it. We are sending this to 20 people as a holiday gift. No pun intended on the author's last name. Make a note in the survey if you'd like a chance to get a copy. That survey will come at the end of the session. All right, so we are done. Great to have Delphine in Durham, North Carolina here. So glad to have you here as well. How are we doing? We're doing generally sort of well. A little bit down from last week. That's okay. A little bit more eager, but generally things are holding steady. It's a pretty good week across the board. Feeling a little bit less confident about hitting our goals this year, but still pretty high overall. So lots of good things happening here. All right, let's dive right in because I want to get as much time for Lisa as humanly possible. Why DAFs are critical to your fundraising strategy. First, overall, we're seeing a lot of shifts in our research in terms of the number of nonprofits that are actively soliciting donor advised funds. So let's just take a look. We ask this every year. We ask, do you actively solicit? The number has obviously increased. 23, it was 46%. 24, it was 58%. And this year was 64%. So pretty significant growth in a relatively short amount of time. If you are in the remaining 36%, please start asking for donor advised fund grants. If you are in the 64%, you're probably not doing it enough, right? So I just want to name that as well. Why are we talking about this before end of year? Due to the new tax law, the doubled standard deduction from the TCJA is permanently extended. This will push more taxpayers into non-itemizer status. And with fewer donors itemizing, many charitable donations will no longer provide a tax benefit starting in 2026, right? So this is a huge deal. We have seen an explosion of donor advised funds over the last decade. We will see another explosion to an even greater degree over the coming decade. The tax law is almost built to incentivize giving to donor advised funds. It's not actually built for that, but it is the natural impact that will come to pass. 2025 may be the last year some households can claim a deduction for charitable giving, and donors may maximize their giving by bunching gifts this year to exceed the itemization threshold or bunching gifts in the future to get over that 0.5% AGI. Many will choose to do this through a DAF, so they have flexibility to give later. And donors can, of course, front load several years of giving into one DAF contribution and still receive the full tax deduction right away. Smart giving from FreeWill partners, right? We're looking at this. This includes donor advised funds, but is also stock gifts. It is also qualified charitable distributions. You can see this is the dollars raised compared to last July, last August, and last September. Lulu says, what is bunching? Great question. What is bunching? So bunching might be making one donation in 1 year that's the equivalent of 3 years of donations. So you bunch them together and you give all at once. There's a bunch of reasons for that. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Also, in terms of number of smart gifts, you can see September was double last September. And last September was a pretty good year for smart gifts. So this is really important. All right, enough from me. You're so tired of hearing from me. Let us let us tell you about Lisa Barr, who is here. Lisa, in the great city of San Francisco, if I recall correctly.
That's right.
So Lisa is the Vice President of Development for the West at the National Philanthropic Trust. She cultivates relationships with financial advisors, provides consultative support to help clients achieve their philanthropic goals. Based in the Bay, as we've talked about, she leads a team of regional directors who work with advisors and donors throughout the Western United States. So she has an incredible view on how donors are thinking about giving and how advisors are thinking about giving. Before this, she was the director of philanthropic entrepreneurship at the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, which many of you have heard of. She has held an executive director and fundraising roles at nonprofits, arts organizations back on the East Coast. She's the president of the board of directors of the Northern California Planned Giving Council. She's an incredibly impressive woman, as well as being friendly and lovely. So we're so happy to have you here, Lisa. Um, and I'm going to pause my screen share. I'm going to let you share screen and I'll let you introduce NPT.
Okay, great, Patrick. Thank you so much for having me. It's always great to be with you all. Let me get my screen sharing here and get myself organized. Can you see that okay?
Perfect.
Awesome. Okay, great. Great. Well, as I said, very happy to be with you all. And we're going to jump into some great content, I think, about donor advised funds, really with the goal of helping you and your organizations develop or improve your strategies of engaging with donors who have DAFs. And so I know we're going to save some time at the end for questions, about 10 minutes or so. So please go ahead and drop questions in the chat. I did turn them off for a second just not to get distracted because I know this is a very outspoken and curious, inquisitive group. So really excited to engage, Patrick, with you as we have 10 minutes left to talk about any questions that pop up as we go. But let's just jump into our content here. Right. So donor advised funds are something that you are more and more seeing your donors engage with. And we're here to talk about some strategies for how to ride this wave of the increasing popularity of donor advised funds. So over the past decade, we know that donor advised funds have emerged as this major philanthropic force. More than $300 billion has been granted from to nonprofits all around the world from donor advised funds. Since 2014, the number of DAF accounts, the individual donor advised funds themselves, have increased 637% to 1.8 million donor advised funds. And DAF giving now represents a 70% larger share of all charitable giving in the US than it did about 10 years ago. So this growth really reflects not only the popularity of DAFs, but how donors are more and more leveraging DAFs to drive their strategic and sustained philanthropic wishes. So what's our agenda for today? So some of the data that I'm going to be sharing with you as we go through is exploring the opportunity of engaging with donors who have donor advised funds. So according to NPT's most recent donor advised fund report, which analyzes the IRS Form 990 filings for more than 1,100 public charities that sponsor DAFs, there are currently more than $250 billion held within donor advised funds. I will say that these numbers are just about a year old. We are going to have some new data coming out about 3 weeks from now. Rather than NPT's donor advised fund report, we have transitioned our 20 years of research to a great group called the DAF Research Collaborative, which is a group of academics who are already doing some wonderful research in the donor advised fund space. They're going to be leveraging some of our methodology from the past, and they're taking over the DAF report from us. And so we're going to share some data from a year ago, but get ready for some great new DAF data that's going to be coming out in early December. So in this session, we're going to talk a little bit about how you can tap into this $250 billion opportunity. We'll start with a little bit of a refresher about how donor advised funds work. We'll share some more data about how DAFs are growing. And then we're going to do really the meat of our conversation today, where I'll talk a little bit about how donors are using their donor advised funds, what the functionality is that they are leveraging with this DAF, and how you can better respond to the way that they're using DAFs and connect with them in a more meaningful way. Finally, we'll wrap up with a little bit of a case study about leveraging some of these strategies and how those have worked for a charity in the past. All right, so let's just go ahead and jump into our overview and opportunity. So this, I'm going to talk a lot on this slide. I'm not going to talk this much on every slide, but I do want to be sure that we're all speaking the same language about donor advised funds. So let's just start with a little bit of a quick DAF 101 for everyone. So at its core, a DAF is simply an account. It's not an entity. It's just simply an account that is owned by a public charity known as a DAF sponsor, where a donor has made a contribution to establish that account, and they retain two privileges to those assets. They retain the ability to advise on how those assets are invested, and they can advise on how funds are granted out of that organization, out of that DAF, to support the organizations that they care about. So DAFs have been around for a long time, since actually the 1930s, but we know they've really grown significantly, especially over these last 10 to 15 years or so, because donors are understanding that this is a really simple way for them to organize their giving. So I mentioned DAF sponsors, that's the public charities that hold donor advised fund accounts. That could be a community foundation, of course. Patrick mentioned that I come from a community foundation background. It could be a public charity established by a financial institution. That's your Fidelity Charitable or DAF Giving 360, formerly Schwab Charitable, Vanguard Charitable. There are also DAF sponsors who are single issue charities like Jewish federations or large hospital systems or large universities might have their own donor advised fund offering. And then of course there's independent donor advised fund sponsors like NPT, like American Endowment Foundation or others. So let's talk a little bit about the three-phase life cycle of a donor advised fund. I will say these phases are sort of continuous. A donor could be contributing into the DAF, donating out, and then doing that over and over again over the lifetime of the DAF. But it's really simple to think about these three steps of a DAF. The first is the contribution phase. A donor is going to make a contribution of cash or marketable securities, or even complex assets like cryptocurrency or privately held business interests. It's important to note that the tax deduction is received at the time the donor is making that contribution into the donor advised fund. And that's because the donor is effectively giving up legal control of these assets when they contribute them to the DAF. They're contributing them to a public charity, the DAF sponsor, they're giving up control, and they're retaining the advisory privileges over these next two phases. So the next phase, of course, is the investment phase. A donor can recommend how the DAF assets are invested. They're typically going to be choosing from a menu of investment options that are provided by the donor advised fund sponsor. And those assets are going to grow tax-free so that ideally there is more to give away to charities over time. Finally, the important phase here is the grant-making phase, where charities are benefiting from grants that donors are recommending out of the DAF. A DAF can make a grant to any qualified public charity, generally as long as it's serving a charitable purpose. A donor is able to recommend a grant. The DAF sponsor does some due diligence on the charity and then gets that grant out the door. There are also DAF sponsors like NPT that can facilitate direct international grants. So I said a lot here, and I wanted to just also dive in a little bit to the language around donor advised funds. I think as we talk about some of the strategies today of engaging with DAF donors, one of the first best steps you can take is starting to know a little bit more about the lingo of donor advised funds. So you've heard me talk about recommending, you're talking about advising. That's really important here. A donor is simply advising the DAF, a donor advised fund. They're recommending investments. They're recommending grants. At the end of the day, the assets belong to the DAF sponsor, to that public charity DAF sponsor, and the donor is simply advising over how those funds are distributed. It's also helpful to know some of the language donors use around making contributions into a DAF and making grants out of the DAF. So we say contributions, donations, gifts are going into the donor advised fund, and then that donor is recommending a grant out to your organization. So while donors are retaining these advisory privileges, they're no longer legally controlling these assets. But that said, of course, DAF sponsors generally are existing to help donors achieve the philanthropic goals that they've set out for. And so as long as that grant recommendation is meeting the sponsor's guidelines and meeting IRS guidelines, a DAF sponsor is going to get those funds out the door in the form of a grant. So that is my DAF 101, and I hope that's helpful just to get everybody on the same page as we jump into some more of the tactical work here. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about some more data. And so it probably will surprise no one here that DAFs are growing significantly. From our DAF report from 2024, we saw in calendar year 2023 that DAF contributions did dip slightly, but we're seeing the long-term trends of donor advised funds remaining really quite strong. And so despite some economic uncertainty and market volatility we saw in the first half of 2023, we still saw contributions into donor advised funds at $59.43 billion. That makes it the third highest year on record of contributions going into DAFs. Over the past 5 years, DAF contributions have grown at a compound annual growth rate of 9.4%. So that's really signaling some consistent donor engagement and a strong commitment to giving, even in a time where markets were a little bit unpredictable in 2023, the year of our most recent DAF report data. So that's contributions, and let's talk about grant making, money out of the donor advised funds. So we know in 2023, grant making remained tremendously strong. So DAFs distributed $54.7 billion in grants out of donor advised funds. And that's the second consecutive year of DAF grants exceeding $50 billion. It was really just slightly below the all-time high back in 2022. So to put that in further perspective, kind of looking a little further back, we saw that grant dollars in 2023 were 92% higher than they were in 2019 before the pandemic. And if we go back even further, if we look 10 years back, grant dollars have increased 456% from where they were 10 years ago. So this is really signaling to us that DAF donors are using their DAFs very actively, making grants out to the charities that they care about. I would say as I talk with donors about donor advised funds or talk with advisors about whether a donor advised fund is a great tool for their clients, private foundations often come into the conversation. And I want to make it clear that I'm not here to pit DAFs against private foundations. I think that private foundations can be really excellent tools for lots of donors. But I think it is really interesting to take a look at the grant making efficiency of these two vehicles. So that's kind of thinking about grant dollars as a percentage of assets. And when you compare DAFs and private foundations, it's pretty striking. So when we look back at that 2023 data, we saw that DAFs granted out nearly half as much as private foundations, about 48%, while they were only holding about 17% of the assets of private foundations. So to kind of flip it and reverse it and say that a little different way, private foundations held 5 times the assets of DAFs, but granted only about twice as much. So it's really, I think, interesting to see that donors who are using DAFs to support their giving are on average granting out about 20% annually. We're seeing that DAFs are incredibly active vehicles to support a donor's giving. Yeah, I'm freezing up here a little bit. Okay. So who are these DAF donors? And I think it's important for folks to think about the fact that these are your donors. This is not a special group of people who are waiting to hear from you to support your organization, even if they've had no engagement with you or your mission in the past. It's your donors who are going to be increasingly using donor advised funds. And so we're going to talk today a lot about how you can make it appealing for those donors who are using DAFs to support your organizations. And so I mentioned the DAF Research Collaborative previously. This is some of their data from last year. We know that DAF donors tend to be affluent, older, highly engaged in their philanthropy. Of some of their survey information I thought was really interesting. The DAF Research Collaborative found that nearly half of donors that they surveyed, about 48% of these donors, are giving through their donor advised funds for 75% of all of their charitable contributions. So folks are really using these vehicles actively. We also know from the Bank of America's really great philanthropic report that younger generations are very quickly adopting donor advised funds to facilitate their giving as well. They're more and more likely to use a structured giving vehicle like a DAF. We also know that DAF accounts themselves vary really widely, where some DAFs may hold just $10,000 or less. We also see individuals establishing donor advised funds at tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe as a private foundation replacement. And so more and more donors of all sizes are giving giving through donor advised funds. I will just make a little plug here. I usually ask when I present this material in person, who in the room has a donor advised fund? And there's usually only a few hands that get raised at that point. And so I would really encourage everyone to consider establish a donor advised fund yourself. There are providers who can establish DAFs at $0 to start as the balance of the DAF. And it can be so powerful for you to have the experience of being a DAF donor to help shape how you engage with your own DAF donors. All right, so there is also a common misconception. I bet there's lots of questions coming into the chat as we're talking, that money is just sitting idly in DAFs. I'm really sad we didn't get to hear that theme song, Patrick, of getting off your assets. I know that is a common perception about donor advised funds. But as I said before, we are seeing DAF donors use DAFs very actively. We're seeing 20% on average go out of a donor advised fund each year. So DAF grant making has proven to be very resilient even during economic downturns. Donors are using donor advised funds because they know that this money is in the DAF. It's going nowhere but to the organizations that they wish to support. That money is never going to come back to them. It's never going to go to their heirs. The money in the DAF is going nowhere but to charity. And so we're seeing donors use these DAFs as a ready reserve for their giving. So let's just jump into some strategies. I really am hopeful that today you will take away at least a few tips and tools that you can engage, that you can bring into your everyday strategies of engaging with donors. So this is the section where we're going to talk a little bit about how donors are using their donor advised funds, and then how you can leverage that functionality over time to help your organization grow its DAF grants receiving. So here it's pretty clear, DAFs are serving as a reliable, flexible source of charitable funding. DAFs make it really easy for donors to set up recurring grants, to set up grants that can go out over time. But donors are also using donor advised funds to support new projects. So while it might sometimes appear that donor advised funds are warehousing charitable dollars, in most cases, it's not delaying those dollars, it's just giving donors the flexibility to be a little bit more strategic with their giving. So I think it's really important to think of a donor advised fund not as a warehouse, but as a greenhouse where future philanthropy is cultivated and prepared, where those dollars are growing within the greenhouse so that there's more to give away over time. And a donor is sure that they're going to have some ability to provide sustained support to the organizations that they care about most. So what does that mean for you? I think it's important to adopt a mindset that any donor might have a donor advised fund, even if they haven't mentioned it. I think it's so important to make it a part of your appeals and donor conversations to ask a donor, do you have a donor advised fund? Are you planning to support us through your donor advised fund? And even getting more tactical than that, I'd really encourage you to consider adding a way for donors to indicate to you that they are going to support you through their DAF. Maybe that's on the little buck slip that you're sending along with the annual fund letter, or maybe that's on your website where there's a form a donor can fill out to say, rather than giving online, they're going to recommend a grant from you. Even better is to leave a little blank to say, I'm going to recommend a grant from my fill in the DAF sponsor name, National Philanthropic Trust, and that's just going to help you to match those incoming funds to the donor who you are cultivating and soliciting. A common mistake that we see is that there is a little bit of a disconnect from the person in your office who is opening the mail and pulling out checks to getting the grant letter that is accompanying that DAF grant to the right person. And maybe your finance team is in the middle there, and just that information is not being shared. So I'd encourage you to think about some strategies to get everyone in your organization aware of how DAF grants work and how important it is to be sure that you're receiving all the information that a DAF sponsor is sending along with a grant check so that you can be cultivating that donor, thanking them for their giving. It's also a good practice to think about giving the hard credit for a DAF grant to the DAF sponsor, but some sort of soft credit to the donor who has recommended that grant. So for instance, when I make a grant from my donor advised fund, the charity is receiving a check from National Philanthropic Trust, but there's a grant letter accompanying that check that is saying this grant is coming from the Lisa and Miles Barr Fund for XYZ purpose. And so ensuring that your finance team is aware of how to give that hard credit to the DAF sponsor, but a soft credit to the DAF donor, I think can be really important. A little bit more here on soliciting and acknowledging DAF grants. So it's really important to follow best practices when you're sending acknowledgement letters to donors who have recommended a grant to your organization. Those thank you letters should be different than the normal gift receipt that you send when someone makes a credit card donation or sends you a check, because that letter should never state that the grant from the DAF is a tax-deductible contribution. The donor has already received their tax deduction when they made a contribution into the donor advised fund. There's no additional tax benefit that they are receiving for recommending that grant. I think it's also important, the concept of pledges comes up around donor advised funds generally with a lot of confusion. And so just to share a little bit there, we did receive guidance from the IRS back in 2017 regarding multi-year giving from donor advised funds. And that guidance from the IRS said that grants from DAFs can be used to satisfy multi-year giving intentions, but the DAF sponsor cannot reference that pledge in the grant letter. There could be no additional incidental benefit going to the donor. There's no mention in the grant letter, no notes in the memo, no recognition that's linking to that pledge. And so it's on you and the organization to let your donors know you can recommend a grant from your DAF to support this pledge that we already have in place. But that DAF sponsor is not going to be able to reference that pledge when the DAF sponsor is sending the grant to your organization. What can be, and I appreciate like that's not exactly the clearest guidance, and I know that some DAF sponsors treat this differently. It can be really powerful to think about, rather than having a pledge in place with that donor, think about putting a non-binding intention to give, intention to support document in place with that donor. And so you can let the donor know that you're open to receiving support from their DAF, their private foundation, their pocketbook to meet that intention to give form. But now your finance team is saying, hey, we need a pledge. We need to be able to book a receivable here. That's what's important. Well, DAF sponsors can kind of come to the rescue there, where many DAF sponsors are able to enter into multi-year grant agreements directly with the charity. So rather than having a pledge between yourself and the donor, it's a multi-year grant agreement between your organization and the DAF sponsor. So a little bit of a lot there, but as we share the slides or have questions as we get to the end of our presentation, happy to offer more clarity on all these points. But all this to say, DAFs can be a great tool for your engagement with donors, even when there are pledges involved or even when there's multi-year support that the donor is considering. So we've talked about the importance of following best practices when you're receiving and acknowledging DAF grants. And part of that is really understanding the rules of how donor advised funds can be used. And that's where a DAF sponsor's due diligence process comes into play here. So you may have received calls from someone who was not your donor asking for you to verify the purpose of a charitable fund or verify a program that your organization puts on, that was very often a DAF sponsor employee who's calling you to make sure that the grant that a donor has recommended is going to comply with IRS regulations. DAF sponsors are legally required to ensure that grants are only used for fully tax-deductible charitable purposes. And this is especially important when it comes to events. So we cannot have bifurcated grants. Very often you're sending, when someone buys a ticket to your gala, you're going to send them a letter that says, thanks so much for buying the ticket to our gala. That was $1,000, $800 of that is tax deductible. When it comes to supporting your gala from a donor advised fund, we cannot do that 800-200 split. Bifurcated grants are not allowed. The IRS is saying, hey, that is providing a more than incidental benefit to the donor in response to this DAF grant. That's not allowed. So it's really important to have some systems in place so that you're sure the donors who might be supporting your events, who are also using DAFs to support your organization, understand what they can and cannot use their DAF for. So what can be more powerful is, say you have a table sponsorship that's available to a donor at $10,000, that's going to get them 10 tickets to the gala. Rather than soliciting them for that $10,000 table, you should solicit them for a $10,000 grant to support your gala benefit, and then have them out of their pocket purchase tickets to attend the gala separately. So let's jump back into how donors are using DAFs. We know that donors are using donor advised funds to really streamline their giving. Many donors choose to make a large contribution into their DAF in a year when they might have higher than usual income. Maybe that's a business sale or a bonus or some other financial event, an inheritance. This is where that bunching strategy comes into play, where in a single year, a donor will make a large contribution into their donor advised fund to pre-fund future giving. And as Patrick said, as we were getting started today, we're seeing more and more donors use their DAFs in this way, and especially as some tax changes will kick in next year. Lots of advisors are telling their clients, hey, this is a great time to open a DAF. Let's pre-fund a lot of your future charitable giving by making one nice big give to the donor advised fund this year, taking advantage of the current treatment for charitable tax deductions. And then next year, when those tax deductions are slightly less advantageous, the donor can just use those funds within the DAF to sustain their future charitable giving. So what does this mean for your organization? I think that it's important to think about how you can further help donors who are using DAFs think about using their DAF to contribute to your organization. So it's essential to make giving as straightforward, as easy as possible, and to really signify to these donors, to signal that you understand how donor advised funds work. You're using that language like contributions, like grants. And I think if you take nothing away from our conversation today, I hope you'll take away what's in the orange box here to prominently display your organization's tax ID number on your website. That it's not your social security number, this is a public number, and it's so critical to include this information everywhere on your website, maybe at the footer at the bottom, because a donor who has a DAF is very often using that tax ID number to look up your organization in their online portal to be sure that their DAF grant is going to the charity that they intend. So it's also important to think about if your charity appears on GuideStar or Candid under a different name, or if your organization has a very common name, that on your Donate Now page, you have some special information for donor advised fund givers with your full legal name of your charity and that EIN, so that they're sure to be entering the correct organization information into that portal to get those dollars to you. I also think you should keep in mind that DAFs can have a really wide variety of names, often reflecting the donor's own name, or maybe it's just something more vague than that. But very often a DAF donor might name their DAF with the word foundation. It could be the Lisa Barr Foundation, When you're receiving a DAF grant from the Lisa Barr Foundation at National Philanthropic Trust, that's a DAF. That's not my own foundation. And I think just having a way within your systems to keep track of donor advised fund names as you're receiving them will just help you to make the tie between that individual donor and the grant coming to you. So really being transparent about your organization's legal and tax details helps to reduce confusion for donors. It just makes it easier for them to be sure that their grant is getting to the right organization, to your organization. A little bit more on the tactic side of things. So DAFs can play a super powerful role in legacy planning. Many donors have the option to name a donor advised fund as the beneficiary of their will or their trust or a retirement account or a life insurance policy. More and more advisors are encouraging donors as they're rethinking their estate plans to use a DAF as a tool, because when you name some charitable beneficiaries in your will or your trust, if you want to change those over time, you're going to have to pay your lawyer, you're going to have to revisit those documents and make those edits. It can cost a lot of money. Whereas if the donor simply names their DAF as the charitable beneficiary of one of these types of accounts or one of these vehicles, they can easily talk with their DAF sponsor and update the legacy plan they have in place for their DAF. So when a donor establishes a donor advised fund, very often they're putting this legacy plan in place that may include appointing successor advisors. Maybe they're naming their adult children to become the advisors of the DAF once they pass. But many donors are also setting up charitable beneficiaries of their donor advised fund. And so it can be so powerful to have conversations with donors who are granting to your organization through their DAF. Say to them, hey, I know you might have a legacy plan in place for your donor advised fund. Would you consider naming our organization as a beneficiary of your DAF? Donors who have DAFs are probably more comfortable than many other donors having those legacy conversations because they've already had that conversation with their advisor or with the DAF sponsor when they've set up the donor advised fund. So just to say a little bit more about that, it can be so effective to think about donor advised fund donors as great plan giving prospects. You could even consider, inviting these donors to join your legacy society if you have one, or inviting them to come to your plan giving recognition events, really just helping to deepen their engagement with your organization over time. So our last little strategy here to discuss is around gifts of complex assets into donor advised funds. Now, I know many of your organizations have a lot of sophistication around your gift acceptance policy, around the types of assets that you might accept into your organization, be that real estate or personal property, alternative investments, or restricted stock. But for organizations who don't have the ability to accept those gifts directly, calling your friendly neighborhood donor advised fund sponsor can be really powerful. We're here very often at NPT, at DAF sponsors like Charitable Solutions LLC. Many of these organizations have a lot of team members, legal staff, risk folks who are here all day long to help facilitate complex gifts for DAF donors. And so if you have a one-off opportunity to engage with a donor who may be looking to unlock the power of their full balance sheet to make a contribution to your organization, doing that through a DAF can really be really powerful. So as you're having conversations with these donors with more complex assets, encouraging them to think about establishing a DAF if your organization cannot accept those assets directly can be really powerful. And now you might say to me, Lisa, I don't want to have my donor give that complex asset, that real estate or that cryptocurrency to a DAF, because then how can I be sure that much of that is going to be coming to my organization? And two things to say there. One would be, I think very often in that case, when you are providing a solution to a donor, they will be so grateful that you have helped them identify that opportunity to support giving not only to your organization, but to other organizations, that's just really going to help deepen the connection that you have with that donor. But there is also a vehicle called a designated fund that you can think about pointing a donor to as well, where they're going to be naming just a single beneficiary for the designated fund. So unlike a DAF, where a donor can make grants to any organization, with a designated fund, only one organization is the designated beneficiary of that DAF. So very often a community foundation or NPT would establish a designated fund, receive a complex asset into that designated fund, get it liquid, and then grant out the proceeds to the designated beneficiary. So being cognizant of time here and wanting to be sure we have a lot of questions, let me skip over considerations for these illiquid asset gifts and just dive into a really quick overview of a case study. So this is an organization that names have been changed to protect the innocent here, but an organization called Hopewell Community Health that NPT has been able to support through a donor advised fund. And in this case, Hopewell was receiving a lot of DAF gifts, but they weren't actively segmenting DAF donors. They weren't including DAF language in any of their solicitations. They really didn't have a lot of infrastructure to support any type of complex gifts, but they really wanted to build some new abilities around engaging with DAF donors. So what did they do? And my hope here is that you could think about within your organization of the tips and tools that we've just walked through, which of these are the lowest hanging fruit for you? And for Hopewell in this case, the lowest hanging fruit was to identify and target DAF donors. They were able to analyze some of their past gifts, do a little bit of a refresh of their CRM system to ensure that they could have targeted outreach for donors who have DAFs. And in that targeted outreach, they refined their appeal language, where they updated some of their solicitation materials to include language like recommend a grant from your donor advised fund to Hopewell, just really helping to signify to donors that they speak the DAF lingo and understand how donor advised funds work. They also segmented donors for legacy outreach. In this case, they invited donors who were contributing through their donor advised funds to some legacy events, really hoping to help them think about the fact that their DAF could be a tool to support Hopewell through their legacy plan. And in this event, they actually identified a donor who was about to be selling a business. And they had the thought of, hey, we can't accept private business interests directly at Hopewell, but let's call, in this case, National Philanthropic Trust, see if they can be a resource for this donor. In this case, NPT did receive a business interest gift from this donor into a donor advised fund. We got that gift liquid upon the sale of the business, and the donor recommended a grant of $750,000 to this organization, which is one of their largest grants in their history. So just a little recap before we jump into some questions, Patrick. These final takeaways I think are so important to communicate how you will credit donor advised fund grants and to include DAF language in all of your solicitations. It's important to think about how you can engage with your CRM system to tag and segment DAF donors, to just speak to them a little bit differently than you do to the broader donor population. And also to think about DAF donors as great prospects for planned gifts and also for major gifts. I don't think I shared this before, but the average size of a donor advised fund is about $150,000. And so even if a donor is sending your organization $500 checks a year, $1,000. If those checks are coming from a donor advised fund, there could be $150,000 or more behind that $500 or $1,000 grant. And so pluck that donor out of your standard donor pool and consider them a major gift prospect. Consider them a planned gift prospect. They have already, put some structure around their giving. These are going to be your most philanthropic donors. And so treating them that way, I think, can just be so powerful in building those ties between your organization and the donor. And finally, partnering with a DAF sponsor to help unlock a donor's balance sheet to make it possible for them to support you with assets other than just cash or publicly traded securities can be really powerful. And so with that, Patrick, happy to jump into some questions. And I think my contact info is here, and I know we'll share these slides later. So please don't hesitate to reach out if we don't get to your question today.
Great. We have a lot of questions, so we have not a ton of time, but we are going to try to get through some of them.
Great.
So while we do that, first, I'm going to put a very quick poll for anyone that wants to take it, which is, hey, do you, let's see where that went. Let's see if we can do this. Whether you have a donor, do you have a donor advised fund? So we're just sort of
Yeah,
curious.
thanks.
for that. So let's just see. We got a lot of votes are streaming in. Really interesting to see. So holding pretty steady at about 15%. We'll give it 1 second,
Okay.
but um, you know, open one, right? And as Lisa mentioned, you don't have the average donor investment is $150,000 in it. You are allowed to open one with less than $150,000. So I have one. It's very helpful to have as we think about supporting organizations with this. So great question to you all. Also, I just want to double down on this idea of making sure that you have really clear language, whether it's through sort of software or through just content on your website. I was trying to make a donor advised fund grant to our friends at Give Directly yesterday. Give Directly does great international development work. And like, I don't want to brag, but like I'm good at this stuff. Right? I spent all my time thinking about nonprofit giving and whatnot. And it still took me a little while because you basically, if you search it as two separate words, it wouldn't come up. You have to
Mm.
search it as one combined word. So anyway, interesting. Results for everybody are 85. I'll give you the results very quickly. 85 to 15 in terms of no to yes, in terms of folks that do or don't. So interesting stuff there. Thank you to everyone who took that. All right, let's get some questions. Um, Janet says, can a donor advised fund be funded by a distribution from an IRA taken as a required minimum distribution?
So no is the answer to that. So that qualified charitable distribution has to go directly to an organization. A donor can name their DAF as the beneficiary of the IRA, but those QCDs cannot go to the DAF. They have to go to your organization directly.
Yeah. And Lisa, other question, I mean, I'll just fire some questions at you.
Yeah.
Is it only 501(c)(3)s? What about something like a 509(a)(3) or things like that? Is it just 501(c)(3) charities that can receive grants?
So generally 501(c)(3) public charities are eligible grantees as well as, international charities that we've determined are equivalent to US 501(c)(3)s. No 501(c)(4)s, no private non-operating foundations. Yes, private operating foundations, but that's pretty rare.
Yeah, makes sense. Um, Here's a question. I mean, how do donor advised funds like how does your salary get paid? Right? A lot of people are saying how does this work? Right? Because they're trying to understand the incentives and the structures. Do you mind just sort of talking a little bit about the economics of running a donor advised fund?
Yeah, sure. So a donor advised fund will generally have a fee assessed on the assets. And so at MPT, we call that the charitable administrative fee. It's generally, 85 basis points and then tiers down really quickly as DAF assets grow, the fee gets smaller or is a smaller percentage of those assets. And that is something that a donor pays out of the donor advised fund. And it's a fee for service, right? Like they are receiving the benefits of having the gift made into the DAF, having those funds advised and invested, having NPT perform due diligence on charities and get those grants out the door. And so that is how, the salaries are paid of DAF sponsor employees who are all employees of a public charity, in this case with NPT.
Yeah. And some of you won't know what basis points mean. Many of you will. Basis points are basically what 1/100th of a percent. So 85 basis points is 0.85%. It's much lower than, say, credit card fees, for instance. Visa, MasterCard, et cetera, make far more money off of charitable giving every year than a donor advised fund does. And then similarly, Lisa, a lot of the funds in a donor advised funds are invested.
Mhm.
Does NPT decide where they're invested? Does the donor decide where they're invested? How does that work?
So NPT decides technically because those are our assets, but that donor is recommending how those assets are invested. And very often they're choosing those investments based on the grant making time horizon that they have. And so if they know they want to be making lots of grants right away and they want to be sure that the cash remains intact to make those near-term grants, they're going to have the DAF invested in money market or, some cash equivalents. Or if they're looking to, make grants over the next 10 years, 20 years, they might treat the DAF more like an endowed fund where they're going to have highly diversified investments so that ideally those funds are growing over time. So there's lots more to give away down the line.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, we are almost out of time. We got to do some very quick announcements, but we didn't. Why are these growing so fast? Like, in if we were having a conversation in 1998, obviously it wouldn't be on Zoom, but
Mhm.
we wouldn't have talked about donor advised funds, and yet a lot of the possibility existed. What in your mind is really driving this exponential growth that, again, is likely to continue in the future? I mean, I think, we could be I don't know, 4 or 5, 7 years out from having $500 billion sitting in donor advised funds ready to be granted?
Yeah, I would say that the just the ease of donor advised funds is what's driving their growth. You know, your most philanthropic donors who are contributing to your organization and probably another 10 or 15 organizations, they're having to, make those make those gifts out of pocket to you, get back all those gift receipts, get those to their accountant. Like there's a lot of administrative burden that comes from just giving out of your pocketbook or giving appreciated securities directly to an organization. So I think donors really find appeal in being able to get a big chunk of capital into the donor advised fund, very often timing that with maybe a big tax bill that they're experiencing and using that DAF to then just organize their giving in a more simple way to have that front loaded capital available to give over time.
Yeah, I think this is a really important point. One other thing I want to say is that, I mean, Lisa mentioned this, is folks like NPT are just fundamentally better than almost all of your organizations at taking non-cash assets, which is one of the fastest way to grow. And so on top of getting really good at soliciting DAF grants, you also want to continue to get good at taking stock gifts, um, taking some of these gifts from an IRA, et cetera, et cetera. And so just, keep that in mind as you go towards the end of year. It's a really great opportunity to do so. Okay. I hope everyone will join me in thanking Lisa. Just an unbelievably great session. Thank you so much. It's so nice to see this from your perspective. So we're just everlastingly grateful and thank you so much.
Thanks for
Um,
having me, Patrick.
you're so welcome. My colleague Phoebe is dropping a survey in the chat now. We'd love for you to fill it out. We're going to send a copy of Wisdom Takes Work by Ryan Holiday to 20 people as a gift. We are also, by the way, if folks are interested in seeing more technology around donor advised fund gifts, stock gifts, et cetera, you can actually book a one-to-one meeting directly in the survey. So that's super cool. That's a new thing that we have recently. So enjoy that. And then the next session is on December 9th. So it's a little bit of ways because we have Patrick's on a hike and not talking to you all, unfortunately. Then we have Thanksgiving week, and then we're going to come after that. And we're gonna meet with some of the sort of experts at some of the largest nonprofits and understand how they are thinking about 2026 and how they are planning for it. So that should be an excellent session. We're finalizing the guest list right now. So please, if you want to invite to that, also make a note in the survey. And if you have any creative ideas to share, if you need anything at all, just shoot me a note at patrick@freewill.com. Lisa, you can connect with her on LinkedIn. Lisa Barr, National Philanthropic Trust, easy to find. Just a great person to be connected with. And so we're so grateful to have you here.